What's going on, guys? It's Danny from Store Restoration, and today we have a 2011 GMC Denali XL, Yukon Denali XL in the shop, and it's getting a few things. One of them is obviously we have the oil draining. So the oil pan's coming off. I'm going to show you how to do that. We'll do a new oil pan gasket. Wasn't really leaking, but inside there's an O-ring on the oil pump pickup tube, and this thing did have kind of intermittent low pressure or low oil pressure. Not extremely low, but enough that it was noticeable by the customer. So it didn't happen all the time. So just to rule that out, we have to do some other front end work. So we're going to drop the pan, do a new gasket, and that new oil pump pickup O-ring. So as I mentioned, first step is drain the oil, because the oil pan's coming off. You want it as drained as possible. So we open this up, let it warm up, let it run, let it warm up, dropped the oil out, took the oil filter off also, and just let that drain for a couple hours. We do still have to take, I should have did that while it was draining, but the oil cooler lines bolt to the side of the oil pan, and that does look like that gasket might have been seeping a little bit, so we'll definitely make sure we replace that. But there's two 10mm bolts right there that come off, and that whole cooler block comes off the side of the pan, which is going to allow a little bit more oil to drain. So we'll go ahead and do that, let that continue to drain, and then we'll work on doing some other things. And one of the first things is going to be, we have to pull this front differential out, because it's in the way of getting that oil pan along with that cross member right there, and it just gets held in by these, they're quite large bolts, but there's two per side, and then that whole cross member will come down out of the way. I'll show you in a second how to remove that differential. It's not all that difficult either. And since we're taking this differential out, to make it easier to get to that, we're going to go ahead and remove this front dry shaft. And it's two, actually they're 11mm bolts with a strap on either end. So there's 4 bolts and 2 straps that hold that U-joint in, and then we can take a pry bar and just gently pry that out, and then we'll let that dry shaft just come down and rest on the sway bar for right now, and we'll have a little more room to access that oil cooler block. Gets you some light up there too. So with the dry shaft out of the way and those 2 bolts removed, as you can see, the oil cooler line is now leaking. We can just kind of grab that and pry it. Sometimes it get a little bit stuck, but this one was already seeping, so I think it's going to pop right off, and we can just kind of move it to the side. Should be enough room to leave it there. I believe there is, it's hard to see with this differential in the way, but I believe there is a bolt with a clamp that holds those cooler lines to either the block or the oil pan a little bit further up, but it should not be a problem, and it shouldn't be in our way. All right, so we went ahead and removed the front wheels, because like I said, we have more stuff we're going to do. We're actually doing lower ball joints and upper A-arms and maybe outer tie rods, and there's an end link that's also broke on here, which we'll repair at the same time. But we got all that out of the way. Gasket out of there. We'll replace that gasket as it goes back together at that oil cooler block. I didn't mention this, but it's a good idea to mark everything as you take it apart. So the dry shaft into the yoke, and then we do have to pull this differential. So we're going to break the axles loose at the differential itself. So I just marked them with a little bit of green paint so we can line them back up. Eliminates any chance of being in a different clocking and having any kind of vibration. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and remove these bolts. I believe they're 15mm, and it's 6 bolts on each axle, which will allow this axle shaft to come off of the flange there at the differential on this side. And this side's a little bit further away, and it's out here. And with the axle nuts removed, you can just kind of push those axles, pull out a little bit and push up. We don't need to completely remove it at this point. That's good enough. We also got the bolts out of this cross member, so we can grab it, kind of wiggle it out of its spot here, and that will come right out. Might need a pry bar to finish taking that out, but you can see we almost have access to that oil pan now. And because this is all-wheel drive, it's really almost, the front differential is almost out. There is a vacuum line right here. It's a vent tube right off the front, right above the fill plug right here. And then there is, right over here, there's a mount. So there's a large, I think it's 22 millimeter nut with a stud. So we're not going to take any of the mounting brackets off. We're going to take the differential bracketry off of the bracketry. So 2 studs, one on either side, front and back, 22 millimeter nuts. We'll loosen that up so you can see it's loose there. And on this side, kind of the same deal. On either side of the axle, there is a bolt there and a bolt back there, and they are 18 millimeter. So with that loose, to get the differential out, just to recap, axles, 6 bolts per side, your vacuum line or breather tube here, your drive shaft, and then 2 bolts this side, 2 bolts this side, and that whole thing will drop down. We do have a transmission jack because we can just we can raise that up, drop that out, and just wheel the whole thing to the side. It's light enough you can grab this and move it around, but we have this and we're going to use it. The only other thing, if this was not an all-wheel drive, so it was a regular Yukon and or Suburban Tahoe, it would have another electrical connection right here, and that's what this engages the 4-wheel drive. You can kind of see the boss for it. It would have a solenoid or a motor here with an electrical plug. We don't have it because we are an all-wheel drive Denali, so let's go ahead and get this thing dropped out. As you can see here, as we're dropping down, you kind of just let the passenger side hang down, and it will literally pull right out of there once it clears these studs. It is above this bracket here, but it literally drops and slides right out. So we'll get that out of the way, and we'll be ready to tack that oil pan. We may have to, it's a little bit tight up there where the rack and pinion lines are, so we may have to loosen the rack up and move it. I don't really want to loosen the lines up if possible. So now we're down to here, we can actually get to the oil pan bolts. And before we do that, we already removed that clamp I was talking about. It actually goes to the block, but it's kind of in the way for the oil cooler lines. And by the way, we are going to replace them. We are going to replace these oil cooler lines because they're crusty, especially right where that clamp was, and they were seeping a little bit. You can see the drip there, and it's wet right up there by the crimp. So while we're in here, we're going to do as much maintenance and preventative maintenance, I guess, as we can. So we got that clamp off. There is another one over here that holds the transmission cooler lines and that harness. It actually does bolt to the pan, so we have that removed, and we can kind of push that to the side so we can go up through and get the bolts. And then lastly, up front, there's this plastic trough that holds the wires. There's one 10 millimeter bolt that goes in from the driver's side right here, and then you can grab that, slip it to the side, and it pulls down out of the way, and we can get to those bolts right up front there. So let's go ahead and zip these bolts out. They're 10 millimeter, and I believe actually these look like they're 10 too. Sometimes these back bolts are actually 8 millimeter, but these appear to be 10. There is 2 bell housing bolts we'll have to address too, one there and one there, and that will allow our pan to be free. Then we'll know whether we can get around the rack or we're gonna have to loosen the rack up. And you guessed it, you do have to move. We are gonna have to move that rack out of the way because there's just not enough room to get that through there. The pickup tube comes down pretty far, and there's a baffle in the pan. And it's just not even worth messing with. So it looks like there's 4 bolts to hold the rack in. We got this front pan off, so there's a large one there, there's one through that hole, and then one right there that holds this side in, and that should allow, we should have enough movement there, even with the steering arm hooked up, to drop that down just enough to get that pan out. Have those bolts out, and as you can see, the rack dropped down pretty far. We have plenty of room now. I have my pole jack supporting the pan so it didn't fall out. So I'll just move that out of the way, and it should drop literally straight down. And there you go, pan's out of the way. Now you can see that pickup tube. So to remove that, there's a, I believe these are 13 millimeter also, 13 millimeter there. There are two nuts on the studs. And then there is a bolt right there at the oil pump itself, and that holds the front of the tube in, and that's where the O-ring is that we're going to replace. So this pan was actually sealed up pretty good. It's kind of a shame we had to pull it because it didn't seem to be leaking at all, but we're definitely going to put a new gasket going back together because we're apart, and why not? The gasket technically is reusable, but I wouldn't do all this work and then reuse the old gasket. It just seems silly. So we'll go ahead and get this off, and I'll show you how to manage that O-ring. With these two bolts off and that 10 millimeter bolt out of the oil pump, we just kind of pull down on that and wiggle it out of the front of the pump. We got our drain pan, nothing's coming out, so we're good to go with that. And let's just set it down here. And there's the O-ring in question. They don't always, can't always tell when they're bad. Sometimes they will be split or shrunk down. They usually get a little bit hard. Either way, we're going to replace it. So we have that gasket off, and as you can see, it's actually flat. The new one is actually round. It's an O-ring. What happens over time is the heat gets to them and it deforms them. You can kind of see the markings on it where it was sealing really good, and it actually got extremely thin in areas. And that's kind of what happens over time. Again, this was intermittent. Sometimes it would be fine, and other times the oil pressure would dip down. Not that it would lose oil pressure, the light never came on, but it was definitely lower than it should have been. And with these engines being the displacement on demand, they have the DOD lifters, you want good oil pressure. So we'll go ahead and lube up our new O-ring. The GM ones I do believe are color coded. That one we took off was obviously red. The new one, this is a Felpro, and it came from the parts store. It's black. Just size it up, make sure it looks right. There is different ones throughout the years, and like I said, I think GM actually color codes them red, green, and maybe black, but this one seems to be correct. We'll put it on here and make sure, obviously you don't want it to fall on this tube here, which you don't. We'll put some oil on it to lube it up, slip it over there, and then we'll make sure when we slip it back in that oil pump hole right there, that it goes in with some resistance. You don't want to tear it going in, but you want some resistance. You don't want it to fall right through into the hole. So all right, so once we have that back in there and we have the bolt cleaned up, I did put some thread locks or thread sealer, thread locker on there, some Loctite on that bolt, and we torque it down to 106 inch-pound. It's a small bolt, so it's 106 inch-pound. It's in between 8 and 9 foot-pounds if you only have a foot-pounds torque wrench. But once that's done, we'll go ahead and tighten these two nuts up to hold the tube in, and we'll get all this cleaned up and get it ready for the new oil pan gasket. And the only this is pretty clean. This engine actually has 217,000 miles on it. It looks pretty good inside. So the 4 areas you really need to pay attention to is where the front and back cover go on. So in these corners, so we'll take a razor blade and get rid of this silicone here, wipe everything dry, and then we'll go ahead and put some more silicone in these 4 corners right where the front and back cover meet the oil pan rail, and we'll be good to go. After prepping the pan, if you don't already know, the factory oil pan gasket is held on by 2 rivets, one right back here and one right over in this area. Take the appropriate measures, but you can just take a drill bit. It's an aluminum rivet, no big deal. You can drill them out, or you can take a punch and just shear it off. Once you have that off, clean the whole pan up, And we have our new gasket here. We'll drop on here, and obviously it only goes on one way because of these oil passages over here by the oil filter housing. So we'll put that on there. You don't need to rivet this on, and it actually doesn't need any sealer on the pan side because it's a solid surface, and this is an O-ring gasket. But we can put a couple, like maybe 4 bolts in, and there's spots that will hold the bolt in the gasket, and that'll keep everything aligned up. So before we actually put the pan back up, again, we're going to dab some silicone in those 4 corners, and then we'll gently put the pan back in place and start some bolts. With all the bolts back in, they're all just kind of snugged up a tiny bit because we do have to align the oil pan. It's pretty easy when the transmission's still on this type of transmission because it has a full bell housing. So what we're going to do is just make sure it's snugged up to the engine. We'll put these back 2 bolts in we removed when we took it apart, and we'll just pull that pan flat against the bell housing, and then we'll go ahead and torque the rest of the bolts down and then tighten these up lastly. So there is a torque sequence, but pretty much you're going to start in the middle and kind of go back and forth and work your way out towards the perimeter. Got the oil pan on, all the bolts torqued down, but we are, like I said, going to do some additional things to this thing as we go. And before we put the differential back in, it will make it slightly easier. We're going to go ahead and change the oil cooler lines. So they come up here, they snake their way up past the beside the oil pan itself, and they actually bolt to the side of the block there, and it just makes it easier with that differential out to remove these lines. It's doable without doing that, but it's going to be much quicker and easier now. So they come over here to this fitting. There's one there, one at the bottom on the radiator itself, and they have these little clips you have to remove along with this plastic. Get this little plastic retainer. You slip that plastic retainer back, and then you pull that clip off where the fitting is in the radiator, and then it's just a quick disconnect hose, and it just comes out. No big deal there. And it does have one retainer there by the fan shroud. Once you unclip that, undo the hoses here. That's a quick disconnect. Then we already had it unbolted at the engine, and it's already unbolted at the oil pan itself. So we have a drain pan under there, caught the rest of that oil. We'll go ahead and slip these lines out, slip the new ones in before we put that differential back. But again, since we're already in here, I did notice as I was pulling this around, it felt a little weird as you gave it gas, so there is a broken motor mount too. So we're going to go ahead and tackle that. So let me see if I can shoot you through the wheel well here. Yeah. So I'm going to put you in through here. Those 3 bolts right there that go straight down towards the ground, they're actually not straight down, a little bit of an angle. You're going to remove those 3 bolts. And then there are 4 bolts at the engine. Let me grab the new mount and I'll show you how. So here's the actual new mount, and this is the whole assembly. You can buy it without that top bracket, but it's, for some reason, it's actually cheaper if you buy the whole assembly. Doesn't make sense, but right here is those 3 bolts I just showed you on the frame. So you're going to remove those 3. That's what connects the mount to the frame. And then up top here, 1, 2, 3, 4 is where it actually connects to the engine block. But you have to go through this way to access the bolts there. So 2 down here, and then through the heat shield is 2 more. So it's a little bit of a pain to get down in there, but again, it's doable. And because we have a little bit of extra room down there now with the differential out and a couple other things removed, we're just going to go ahead and tackle this right now, get this new mount installed, and that'll be that. And with all the bolts out, we were able to get that motor engine mount out. It's definitely a tight fit. Having that differential out helped tremendously. I don't know if you could get it out of that hole without having the differential out, but honestly, the differential comes out so fast. If I was doing this job, I probably would drop it and just get through there. But obviously we have it out, so it's doable. We have the pole jack under the engine just to jack that side up, and it pretty much comes, kind of rotate it and pull it backwards, and it'll come out right through that hole there. So with that being said, let's take a look at it, and we can see, you can see the crack in it. It's actually totally broke. They do have an interlock in there, so it won't, the engine won't completely move, but this had to have caused some vibration. And like I said, as soon as I got in the truck to move it, I could feel that something wasn't right. So I'm glad we went ahead and took care of that while we were in there, save a little bit of work. And of course we matched our new one up. It looks identical in every way, so we'll go ahead and put this back up in the same way, kind of reverse rotation as we pulled it out. It's a little dark in there, and you're probably not going to be able to see what I'm doing, but pretty much you're going to put that mount up and just kind of do a rotation, and it's tight. You just got to wiggle it and do whatever. You might have to jack the engine a little bit more, use a pry bar, but it goes in there, and once it pops up over top of this frame section, then this tab here, that stud sticks down through and lines everything up. You can start your bolts at the engine, go ahead and snug them up, and then you can drop the engine back down in, and from up top you can get those 3 bolts right there. With all that finalized, oil cooler lines are all done, motor mount, engine mounts all tightened up, snugged up top and bottom, and the wire loom, don't forget to put your wire loom back on the front here, and the 2 access panels, or little plastic covers back here at the bell housing, all that's snugged up. Like I said, the oil pan's torqued down all over the place. We did put a new oil filter on. Oil drain plug is now tight, and it's time to put the differential back up. Again, it just you kind of rotate it and it goes up. It's pretty easy, 4 bolts and then 6 bolts per side on the axle. And don't forget to hook up that vent tube right here. It goes right here. And again, with this being an all-wheel drive, there is no electrical to it. If it was a part-time, like Suburban or Yukon, it would have an electrical connection right here. So let's get that done, and we'll keep rolling on this. And of course, once you have everything tightened up on the differential, a bolt here, bolt there, 2 nuts here on these studs sticking down, and then your 6 axle bolts per side, remembering to line it up as you indexed it when you took it apart. On this side, we have our dry shafts reattached. Remember to tighten them up. And we have our cross member back in, and two bolts per side holding that in. So we'll go ahead and snug that cross member up, and we're pretty much done that part of it. So we did oil pan gasket, the O-ring inside on the pickup tube. We also did engine oil cooler lines because we were there and they didn't look real healthy, and we did that engine mount on this side also. So this thing should be in pretty good shape. We still have a few things left to do to it, but that's probably going to be another video. We do have to top off. Don't forget to top off or refill your engine oil before you start it. Other than that, thanks for stopping by. Have a good day.